Hello and welcome to the latest Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce Q&A. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Matt McDonald, who's an employment law partner at Shakespeare Martineau, one of the region's leading full-service law firms. Matt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what we thought we would talk about today, are the real hot topics that you're dealing with right now in terms of employment law. What are the issues that are most vexing business and that you're sort of seeing a lot of crossing your desk? Because I know that just as that little bit of context, I'd imagine the issues have changed, haven't they, over the course of the pandemic, and we cast our minds back to March and April last year. Suddenly everyone's this new word, furlough, which we're all firmly familiar with now, was we were trying to work out what does it mean and how do we apply that and deal with that. But obviously 10 months in, it's different now. And I suppose, just to get your sense on how things have maybe progressed and what are some of the key issues that you're seeing at this moment in time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you're right. For 2 or 3 months back last year when furlough was first introduced, everyone was wrestling with it. It was such a fundamental change. We've never seen anything like it before in the field of employment law, so there was nothing we could look back on and say, okay, yeah, this is how this is going to work. Obviously, the guidance was changing week by week, so it was a very, very busy time for employment lawyers trying to wrestle with that and trying to get our heads around the various guidance, some of which was contradictory. Obviously, understandably, it was a lot of last-minute stuff coming out, and the landscape was changing all the time. But employers kind of got their heads around that, and then there was a period, you may remember, later on in the year when it looked like furlough was going to be phased out, and it did start gradually being phased out. And unfortunately, that's when we did start seeing redundancies. And then frustratingly, a little bit later, a good news story on the one hand, which was the furlough scheme was extended, and it's now been fully extended to currently the end of April. We'll have to see what happens thereafter. So that was good news on one hand, frustrating on the other hand, because we did have some employer clients coming to us saying, if we'd known this was going to happen, we wouldn't have needed to make redundancies. So that's slightly odd situations of some employers trying to bring people back that they've just made redundant. But it was ultimately a good news story overall, and I'd say furlough been, broadly speaking, quite successful.
I think it's been the biggest success, hasn't it, really?
Absolutely. It's the one thing, there is no doubt there would be thousands and thousands more people out of work now if it wasn't for the furlough scheme. So overall, despite those hiccups, if you like, it has been quite a success story. So that's been good, but it's relatively settled, and we've now got a situation where it's not just people who are completely off work, you can have part-time furlough as well, so people working a bit and partly furloughed. So that's been good. That's given employers a bit of flexibility as well. And we're now at a point where actually the queries that we were seeing for months and months around that time have quietened off. I think people have basically got their head around furlough, like you said, it's become part of the lexicon now. It's something no one flinches at when you hear it. So it's embedded, and that's good. So what we're seeing more now, I think, are employers, and this particularly obviously with the development of the vaccine over the last couple of months in particular, starting to turn their thoughts to, well, okay, it looks like for those employers that have had a lot of people working from home, or just not being able to work at all, what is that return to work going to look like, and what are the main issues going to be? And speaking of the vaccination, that's probably where most of the queries we're seeing now centre around. And funnily enough, one of the main issues, it seems, and this is a sad story really, is that there's a reasonably large minority of people, it is a minority, but it's a significant minority, who don't want to have the vaccine for various reasons, some of which are probably more legitimate than others, because obviously there's conspiracy theories out there that have had a fair bit of airtime in the media. Bill Gates is putting a microchip in me, this kind of thing. So there's slightly more outlandish reasons, to people who have more legitimate, I suppose you can put it that way, more legitimate concerns around the fact that, at the end of the day, this is the fastest a vaccine has ever been produced in history. So it's not been, we don't know if there's any long-term effects to it. Those kind of concerns that are a bit more mainstream, if you like, in terms of the views. So we're having this issue where I think employers are having to think, well, what am I going to do with these individuals who won't have a vaccine? Do I bring them back to work? Because if you do, there's obviously potential problems with that in terms of them infecting other people. And yes, hopefully most of workforce will have been vaccinated themselves and will therefore have a high degree of protection. But we know it's not 100%, it's quite a way off. So
there's a lot of focus then, and this is on that sort of return to the office, and it struck me that throughout this period, I think back to late summer, there was quite a push around being socially distanced in the workplace and safe, and what would you do, the 2-meter rule, and we've done it here at the chamber. I know lots of members have made sure you've reduced capacity, but you could have 30, 40, 50% of workforce in, and so as we've gone into the autumn and winter and second and third lockdowns, offices have largely emptied out. But you're right, so people now are sort of going, right, when lockdown eases and there maybe is a greater sense to get back in the office. It's not just now about being socially distanced, but it's interesting how, I guess, as you say, have you been vaccinated? Sort of data gathering, isn't it? Who in our staff has been, who hasn't? So you finding the same around lateral flow tests or other, elements of, before you come to work, you need to have taken this precaution and that precaution? It must, from an employment law point of view, it must be kind of really complicated, I guess, as what you can demand and require, and people don't get a vaccine who've been offered it or refuse to take a test. What you can do and how it impacts that employer-employee relationship.
Yeah, if you've hit the nail on the head, that's what this is. That's why this is so problematic, because it's inherently private, invasive stuff. Obviously, you wouldn't normally, these are, albeit fairly minor, but medical procedures in terms of getting tests and having the vaccine. And it's a personal choice. No one is obliged to be vaccinated or take a test. And as an employer, you can't physically force someone to do it, of course. It becomes a question of, well, can you persuade them? And I think that's fine in terms of practical steps. Persuading people that they should get the vaccine and need to take tests and giving them reasons for that will hopefully persuade them to do it voluntarily is the best way forward. But yeah, the problem area comes with those individuals who won't agree, and what do you do? And there's lots of different options available, some of which are riskier than others, right up to potentially dismissing people who won't have a test or won't come back. That's pretty draconian, obviously.
And do you do that? Is that like you'd need to make amends to people's contracts, or will we start to see COVID specific clauses in employment contracts? Or
you might well see that in the longer term, in terms of people having, because it's already commonly seen in employment contracts, clauses requiring people to go and get medical reviews, which is just in your standard. If someone's off sick for whatever reason, you want to get some medical input so that you can have a better idea from an expert as to what the prognosis is and plan their return to work accordingly, and any adjustments that you might need to make. Obviously, disability discrimination might require you to make reasonable adjustments in order to avoid discriminating against someone on the basis of a condition if that is a disability. So those kind of clauses are fairly common. So I wouldn't be surprised in the long term if we see those being expanded a bit, which is fine looking in the long term. The trouble in the short term is that you can't just unilaterally change someone's contract. So at the moment, when you're asking someone to do a test or to encouraging them to get a vaccine, no one or hardly anyone is going to have a clause in their contract which you can point to and say, well, actually, I'm contractually entitled to do this. So you're in that situation where if they can legitimately say, well, you can't oblige me to do this, so no, I'm not going to agree to it. That's the legal position, but practically speaking, what are the steps that you can take? And it's not just as straightforward as because it's not in their contract, you just have to hold hands up as an employer and say, oh, well, forget it, then we'll carry on, because you still need to manage that individual. And I suspect we might get situations where, I talked about dismissal being draconian, softer measures might include things like requiring people to work from home for a longer period until more of the general population is vaccinated, on the basis of saying, look, fair enough, if you don't want to get a vaccine, that's your choice, but we're not happy to have you in the workplace where you might be risking the health and safety of your colleagues, some of which might not be vaccinated yet because they're in low risk age groups. And even those that have been vaccinated, as I said, we know it's not 100% effective. So there is still that element of risk, and you have got an obligation as an employer to look after your employees' health and safety. It's a fairly fundamental obligation that exists in law. So it's not just a one-sided thing. You have got to think about the other people who have had the vaccine and are, on the face of it, able to return to work. Well, what are their concerns going to be? Are they going to be happy knowing they're sat next to someone who's not had the vaccine, particularly if they themselves haven't yet had it, even if they want to, or as I say, if they've had it, but they're not 100%.
Just, and it's going to be complex. There's been so many different circumstances, but the last 10 months, again, it's been proven that the jobs can be done, remotely. We've all, I think, sort of universally experienced that. And I suppose that debate about, well, while yes, I was in the office for 5 days a week, I can do my job perfectly well. I've now got, been doing that for 10 months. I want to either keep working from home fully, or certainly, a part of my time. And so they're conversations that people are going to have to be having, aren't they, with their workforce?
Absolutely. And I think for the most part, it's probably going to be a pretty happy compromise, I'd say, because equally for employers that have now realised actually a lot of these people can work from home either completely or at least to a large extent, all of a sudden looking at the amount they're paying for rent on big premises and thinking, hang on, that's a heck of an overhead. We really don't need that. So yes, I think we will get a lot of people probably making formal requests to work flexibly, because at the moment, most people are doing it by sort of informal agreement. Not many employers have sat down and said, right here, we're going to amend your contract and say that you're now working from home until the pandemic's over, something like that. Just hasn't really happened. And most people, at least at the outset, were focusing more on the perks of working from home. Obviously, 10 months later, people are suddenly craving going into the office like they never were beforehand. But yeah, I think for the most part, it's going to be quite a positive thing, because people will say, I want to work from home longer, and employers, or more, sorry, a higher proportion, if not the entirety of my working time. And for the most part, employers are probably going to think, yeah, that works for us actually, because we're probably going to, well, in the short term, we're still going to need an element of social distancing. And so we couldn't have everyone suddenly piling back. So it'll help on that front. And in the longer term, really reassessing whether the size of premises and the costs that go with that are necessary going forward. But there will probably be some situations where individuals will be saying, look, I've worked from home fine, and therefore you sort of have to, as an employer, agree to this request I'm making. And I think the problem with that is that there will be quite a few employers who will say, well, it did work for that period and it has worked, but we've been muddling through. It's not been a normal world that we've been operating in. So clients, customers, everyone has been giving us more leeway. When we get back to normality, can that job still be done effectively, certainly 100% from home? And I think there will be some question marks around that. And that's where they're the sort of grey areas that I think are going to arise, where you might have employers saying, look, okay, we're happy for you to work from home more than you were, but we do need you in the office a bit, be that for internal meetings or face-to-face meetings with clients, customers, whatever it might be. And that's where you might get a bit of friction, I think, particularly for people who want to work from home completely.
And so from your perspective then, when we're in this unique situation, where do you go for the precedent? And I mean, is that there, or how do you advise people? Because I suppose in any situation, the best advice is to talk and to avoid disputes, isn't it? And to really get into those entrenched positions, because I'm not trying to do you out of some work here, but it's that, you're right. People have been muddling through, and there's been I guess, understanding and goodwill on lots of sides. And the people management element is so important here, isn't it? To keep people motivated and to ensure that productivity stays high. But it just sort of feels like it's going to be, from an employment law point of view, it must just be both fascinating, but it will be remarkably busy and testing, because there's so much which is kind of new coming through as a result of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And people have always been able to request to work flexibly, of course. So theoretically, before the pandemic, someone could have said, I want to work from home, and an employer would have to consider that. And there are certain prescribed reasons in employment law that allow you to say no to a flexible working request. So if you have a good reason, that on the face of it should be fine. The main legal risks tend to come around discrimination. So that's particularly indirect sex discrimination is the most common one that's come up historically, which is essentially where people haven't been flexible enough with their workforce. And women have been able to claim because they bear the brunt of childcare responsibilities. That's still an accepted principle in the courts. It might well change in the future, but for the time being, it is. So the idea being that kind of blanket approach actually indirectly discriminates against women who because it impacts on their childcare. So there are legal risks of saying no. So that's one reason to consider these very carefully. But apart from that, even if you think you're legally in a strong position, if it's something you can agree to, why wouldn't you? You know, it's going to lead to a happier workforce. And like I say, it's going to be increasingly difficult for employers to turn around and say, no, it doesn't work. Because people will say, well, it has for 10 months. So, or well, it'll be longer by then, probably a year plus. So employers, I think, do need to give careful thought of if they're thinking this isn't going to work, maybe don't leap to that conclusion. Have a look at what happens over the following few months. Or it's always better to, and this applies whenever you're looking at any sort of flexible working request, if you can, it's always better to trial it out or see how things go, because one of two things will happen there. Either it'll work, in which case, great, carry on, or there'll be lots of issues that you'll come across, and then you'll be able to sit down with a person and say, look, we're not making this up. These are all the problems that arose, so we're going to have to, in this case, for example, say, look, we do need you in the office, but a couple of days a week rather than full-time from home. Better to do that than at the outset saying, no, it won't work, when people are understandably going to say, well, why not? It's worked this so far.
And I suppose a really important consideration as well is just, general mental health, isn't it? And sort of, I mean, we all know and experience the challenges of the pandemic and just the conditions in general. And I suppose, I think there's been a far greater awareness of the impact on people's mental health and the sort of responsibility as an employer as well around that, not least because probably more people have felt it themselves because of what's gone on. But is that sort of factoring into a lot of what you're seeing and dealing with as well? I guess it links to sort of the conversation we've just been having as well, doesn't it?
It does, and I'd say even this almost is a bigger issue now. That the returning to work issue is something that employers are looking at and should be looking at for the coming few months. Right now, the mental health issue is a big one to focus on, and because, as you say, the fact that people have been working from home, particularly with schools being closed, obviously you've got people potentially homeschooling, having to try and do a day job around homeschooling. They can't do all of the things they would normally do to relieve stress of the weekend. They can't meet friends and family as they would in the past. So it's a really nasty cocktail, really, of concerns. And yeah, employers absolutely, as I said at the outset, they've got a duty to look after the health and safety of their employees, and that applies equally to mental health as it does physical health. So at the moment, absolutely, employers should already be giving that a lot of focus, really encouraging employees to come forward with any issues that they do have. A lot of employers have kind of advice lines and those kind of things that employees can use, which are great, because then they're speaking to independent people who can signpost them to hopefully get the help they need. But it's just being aware of it. And again, it's a tricky factor, because if you were seeing someone face to face for several hours a day and they weren't quite themselves, you might spot it more easily. But if you're perhaps only seeing your colleagues for one or two Zoom calls for half an hour a week, the chances are they will be all chirpy and high and everything. So some of those signs that might be warning signs for someone struggling with mental health, you just might not see as much as you would. So it's both, right? But working from home both is likely to lead to more mental health stresses and makes it harder to spot. So there's not drastically different things employers need to be doing. They just need to be very aware of these concerns, encouraging, making sure employees know that we're all in this together. Everyone's struggling to certain degrees. Not to be afraid to come forward, not to see it as a sign of weakness or anything like that. Which you'd hope not. When times have changed, and I think there's a much better understanding of mental health issues than there was even 10 years ago, but certainly 20, 30 years ago. It's so much better in terms of the understanding of what these issues are. But yeah, it's a really trying time for everyone. So that's a massive.
So it's changed, isn't it? And I suppose I mean, it's fascinating because there's so many unknowns, and everyone wants to get that sense of what do I do, when do I do it, and there's so many variable factors. We don't know when. We don't know the sort of the staggered return. I assume after lockdown will be in tiers, and the various restrictions, let alone best practices, and then trying to as you say, things like the issues around vaccinations or just sort of testing. People have to tread carefully. I think you're right. To speak to people, it's going to demand probably more awareness than ever, isn't it? And people management skills, and I suppose likewise, managers, leaders are can be at a low ebb as well, because all of these factors are impacting them. Absolutely, and it's just not a time to be switching off. It's a time to be making sure you've got the right advice and support, from the likes of yourself, and there's a ton of information out there, and it's just making sure that businesses don't stumble into issues, isn't it, really, right now?
It's planning ahead. Communication's a massive thing. Communicate, which again is harder because everyone's working remotely, but it's doable, and you really need to speak to people. It's only through doing that you'll understand which particular problems affect particular people in your organisation, and you can plan accordingly. You can absolutely have generic plans for how you might deal with certain things, but different problems are going to arrive at different organisations. There might be along similar themes, but certainly some of the specific issues are going to vary from place to place. And if you speak to people, it's a win-win on every front, really, because you will get more information that you need to manage them properly. People will feel that they are being listened to, which they are if you do it genuinely. And that of themselves will make them feel happier, and perhaps they might be more prepared to be flexible than if they feel that their employers are talking to them and all of a sudden they just get a memo saying, right, 2 weeks from now you're back in the office full time. That's potentially going to lead to a bad reaction. Contrast that with a situation where people are consulted, they feel like they've had their say, they get lots of one-to-ones and group, be it Zoom, whatever, but some sort of online briefings. They really feel like it's something that the company has thought through and really with their employees' best interest in mind. And then on the back of that, being asked for their views and potentially coming back on as much or as little as they want, to the extent that the employer can accommodate that. That's a very different picture to the initial one I outlined. So there's all of those things need to be borne in mind.
Matt, that's great. It's a great bit of advice there. Communication, we talk about it a lot here at the Chamber, absolutely essential. I think then good old preparation and preparation, isn't it? And making sure that people are availing themselves of the support and the resources that are out there as we go into the next period of this, hopefully one which is closer to the end than the beginning. I know it's a nice little plug for me to mention the Chamber's Growth Through People month, which is all about people management and trying to provide the sort of the tools, I guess, to be able to manage through periods such as this as effectively as possible. That's coming up in March, so keep an eye on that. But Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Absolutely fascinating. Just a real sort of scratch the surface, but hopefully I know if people are intrigued, want to find out more, then we'll make sure your details are easy to find along with this video over at Shakespeare Martineau. So Matt McDonald, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.